We knew we were moving into a new section where we're dealing with the arrival of Europeans and that we needed a color that was not subtle.
The initial European contact that Potawatomi people had was with the French in the early 17th century. Really, that was a result of them having to flee the central Great Lakes to northern Wisconsin as the Iroquois and the Dutch were pushing in hopes of occupying and taking control of the resources within Michigan.
We had just moved from a section where we're really talking about having soothing colors, engaging with nature, but there was a certain amount of jarring change that was happening. So we went with the burnt orange color because it's still in the earth tone family, but it's still very bold. And it really brings to mind certain things like fire, like violence. This gallery includes a lot of visual representations of what our ancestors were living through at the time. One, because we have a great artist who has done a lot of work in this period. So we were able to use Robert Griffin's work to really highlight what that early relationship looked like. What were our ancestors wearing after they had been introduced to certain European goods, but we're still very much living in a Potawatomi world.
Well, when acquiring the pictures, we just reached out to his home gallery. We acquired them that way in digital form, and from that digital version, we did some interpolation, some editing, did some work with our graphic artists as well. But when we were able to expand them, we actually sent them out for printing. The company that we worked with to install our murals did a fantastic job in printing them. Key resolution, sort of a crowning jewel of Griffin's work.
We also wanted to highlight the material culture because that was what bound these two communities together. It was a relationship of reciprocity and a relationship of shared need from one another. We needed material goods from them and they needed material goods from us. And we really wanted to highlight that stuff, that objects, that things were the tie that bound these two very different societies into one common goal. The middle ground is an academic term that is used to describe the first few generations after European arrival in the Great Lakes region. The French came over as trappers and traders with the goal of making money. They didn't bring their families, they didn't bring wives, they didn't bring children. They really didn't bring a lot of their cultural mores with them. They saw this as a temporary phase in their life where they were going to make a lot of money. Over time, they did begin to intermarry and connect themselves to the tribal communities, sometimes for love, but most of the time and oftentimes because it was a good business decision. At the same time, the Potawatomi still had largely the upper hand at this point. We were still larger in numbers. We knew the environment. We had better access to the furs, which is why the French were there. So there was a real balance. There wasn't one group who could dominate the other militarily, politically, in any kind of way, so that the relationship was able to play out somewhat in balance for the first 30 to 50 years that the French were in what they referred to as the New World, what we refer to as Turtle Island.
A goal that we had for this gallery was to illustrate the relationship between the French and the Potawatomi, in that it was initially a corporate bond, but then it developed into a kindred bond with family ties, to where French traders would marry into prominent Potawatomi villages. And from these bonds and these relationships, a new culture emerged, one in which people recognize as a Métis or a mixed ancestry culture. These Métis children would go on to be very prominent people in the tribe, some of which would be leaders pre and post removal. And to illustrate this and sort of document this lineage and their connection, we created an interactive map to show where the key points of interest, where traders would have established trading posts, where they would have engaged or married into Potawatomi villages, highlighting those village leaders and the family ties and the bonds that were created through that.
We really incorporated the middle ground experience with our Potawatomi families by trying to incorporate some of those early Métis families. We have some images of certain members that are prevalent from those families. We also chose to bring in an interactive that shows some of the names that people that are Potawatomi still know today, that are part of those families that we honor at a festival every year, to show where they started, that they were from these early families who came over as traders and began these relationships, and showing where some of their villages were and how they expanded out over time, and really tying back for our current Potawatomi tribal members that the history that you begin to see as distinctly citizen Potawatomi is beginning at this stage in time.
The original alliance that was created between the Iroquois and the Dutch was one, successful in a way for Iroquois, but also devastating for Potawatomi and Great Lakes people. The original trade between the Iroquois and the Dutch was for pelts. They were traded firearms. And this became a lucrative business which developed into the eastern fur trade. After a couple hundred years, the furs were depleted in the east, particularly the most valuable being beaver, to which the goal at that point was to move west and to occupy lands where they knew that beaver flourished and other valuable furs and other resources as well. So that there were raid and occupational campaigns to move into the Central Lakes. In doing that, it forced the Potawatomi, who at this point did not have equal footing in ways of weaponry to defend and fight off the Iroquois. They were forced to flee north and became refugees in Wisconsin. And while in Wisconsin, as a result of these occupational wars, they came into contact with the French. And at that point, they began to trade lucrative furs for French firearms, sort of leveraging their power in that way, to which they could then successfully defend themselves from the Iroquois and begin to move back into the lake.
My role at the CHC is the collections manager, so I'm over all the objects in the library, in the archive, and the ethnology collection. I got my degree in history, my BA in history, and then my master's is in museum studies. And so I've always loved museum work, and I'm especially drawn to collections work. And so at the CHC, I'm in charge of making sure that the object is housed correctly, because sometimes objects are just thrown into a box and it's detrimental to them. I make sure that all their paperwork is correct, that we have as much information, the provenance to the object. So I spend a lot of time researching objects just to figure out what they are, which is fun because I love Googling things. And I get to talk with Blake about stuff or how we want to approach a certain display. And I also get to help with just doing an inventory of the entire collection. And so we have a lot of really cool pieces, but all of this goes into our collections management system, which is you're measuring the objects, you're photographing the objects, you're just trying to take care of them. I don't think a lot of people realize how much goes into taking care of objects. It's not just slapping a label on something. You have to be able to track it. Where is it housed at? Does it need conservation work? All that kind of stuff. So I'm from Southwest Kansas, and I was working in Wyoming, and I wanted to change. And so I found this position down here with the tribe, and I wanted to learn more about Native American history. I felt like it was a good position, and so that's what brought me here. The most rewarding part of my work is being able to put a list together of items that people can come and look at, because we want to be able to have an open collection and tribal members can come in and look at stuff. And a couple years ago at festival, we had a woman who wanted to come in and look at her mom's dress that she had worn, and her mom had died a year or two before. And I actually didn't know where the dress was at, because like I said, I'm doing the inventory. I don't know where some objects are. And I had a dream, and in the dream, I opened a drawer and that dress was in there. On the way to work, I was freaking out. I was like, if it's in that drawer, I'm gonna die. I opened it and I was like, it's in there. And so having her come in and tell her that, and it's did her mom send me a message or something, and being able to show people these items, and she was very emotional in it. So I just think being able to find items for people who have connections to stuff. So
the display case and the artifacts within really highlight the key trade items that would have exchanged between the French and the Potawatomi during this time. Ways from material and textiles to metal implements, iron kettles, but also firearms, which would have been a key commodity. I think key ways that we highlight this time period and the relationships that were built is one, through our narrative and the imagery that you see, through connections, alliances, or trade that Native communities, specifically us emphasizing Potawatomi and French, but also the goods that they're trading in between each other. Primarily to document the warfare between the Iroquois and the Potawatomi would be firearms. So you'll see a lot of long arms and short arms, but different styles of arms that would have been traded.
In Gallery 4, I had a hand in pretty much everything. I painted, I made the mounts, I displayed, put the objects in the cases, painted the plinths, put the acrylic on, so pretty much everything. I do have a list of items that if we want to go put them on display, they'll need some conservation first. Just because sitting a certain way in a case at a wrong angle can make threads tear more and stuff, and so I haven't come across any like serious conservation work that they've done. And I'm not a conservator. I can only give it so much, but you go to school for a long time to become a conservator, and most conservators are paper conservators or paintings or metals. So I can just look at an object and be like, this isn't in its best condition. So before the grand opening, we were rushing around, painting, last minute install because we were waiting on acrylic and stuff. So it was very hectic, nights until we'd be there until like 1 a.m. Blake and I were there until 1 a.m. and we decided to put this whole case together because we were like, well, we're already here, let's do it.
We selected Bill Madole's silver work, one, because Bill is a pretty dynamic artisan. He's been doing metalwork for years. I know, he acquired the skills from his father and his father from his grandfather, so it's a multi-generational skill that's been passed on. But we wanted to utilize his artifacts because he was so great to donate those to us in the past. But also he focused on capturing artifacts in the way in which they would have looked. I know that he had done a lot of historical research when originally creating them and wanted to highlight each one of those details that specifically draws out what each piece means, the way in which each piece would have been used, and why it was traded, but why it was held to be so valuable by Native communities. The image that you see at the end of the gallery, which serves as a segue into the Warfare Gallery, is a piece of art that was done by Edward Deming in 1900. It documents a key battle in the French and Indian War, which really was the segue between the time period that we're trying to capture in the Contact Gallery as we move into the Warfare Gallery. It was a pivotal time which resulted from these battles for control over resources and furs between colonials and their native allies, which developed into this large war noted as the French and Indian War. But the image itself captures a key battle. The way that it's titled is the defeat of Braddock at the Monongahela River. What it was a battle between British American colonists and the French and Indian Alliance. It was a surprise attack. Stories say that a Potawatomi elder had a dream the night before and devised this battle plan that they were going to utilize the next morning in surprising and ambushing this British column. Ultimately, it was a success. General Braddock was killed. And at that point, things started to kind of turn the tide of the warfare in the French favor. Ultimately, the French would be defeated and have to leave their occupied lands. Given the subject matter that we're wanting to exhibit in this gallery, we thought it would be important to have one of the key features of this time itself being a fort. Forts were meant to be imposing, they were meant to stand out. They were symbols of power, of dominance in the area, and they're just really cool. So we thought that we would add one, sort of the front facade, kind of create a vignette around that. But it would help establish the background for other imagery that we wanted to display. One key portrait that we have displayed is Madeleine Bertrand. She was a Métis, French-Canadian Potawatomi woman. Her father was Daniel Bursaw, who was a French-Canadian explorer, and his wife, an unknown Potawatomi woman. Madeleine would go on to marry one of the first fur traders in southwest Michigan by the name of Joseph Bertrand. They would have several children, many of which would then go on to leadership after removal in Kansas. The overall goal of our gallery is to establish and clearly illustrate the relationship that Potawatomi people had, namely with the French, but with other colonials, and understand that in many ways they supported new ways of life and ways of trade, but also the effects of that, some of which being negative, but also some of which being positive. But showing that these initial bonds were what spurred on the Métis culture that would be seen in future generations, not only in Kansas and Indian Territory, but the relationship that the Métis culture had with the Potawatomi side of the community as well, and showed that how these bonds existed then and how they still exist today.